In Hong Kong, the chief executive announced today that she will formally withdraw a bill that would have allowed Hong Kong residents to be extradited to mainland China for trials. This proposal has sparked months of large-scale, sometimes violent protests. But as Nick Schifrin tells us, protesters' reaction was negative, saying her move is too little, too late.
Judy, it was the bill that launched 1,000 protests. Since April, protesters have filled Hong Kong's streets, clashing on some occasions with police, and at one point ransacking the building where the local government convenes. Hong Kong is an international financial capital, but it has struggled to stay open for business. Last month, the airport was shut down by sit-ins and clashes. Officials in Beijing have labeled the protesters criminals and terrorists. Today, Hong Kong Chief Executive Carrie Lam said she was trying to restore stability.
Our foremost priority now is to end violence, to safeguard the rule of law, and to restore order and safety in society. As such, the government has to strictly enforce the law against all violent and illegal acts.
Lam also discussed investigating police tactics and holding talks with protest and pro-democracy leaders. I'm now joined by a pro-democracy legislator, Alvin Young, a member of Hong Kong's Legislative Council. Alvin Young, thank you for joining us. Is what Carrie Lam announced today enough?
What Carrie Lam said today is too little, too late. If she had done it 3 months ago, Hong Kong people would not have suffered so much. And by now, this so-called withdrawal, of course, is one of the 5 demands that Hong Kong people are asking for. But she did not and failed to address the police brutality. Let's make it very clear here. The system here in Hong Kong, the so-called Police Investigation Committee, has no investigative power. There's no way that this committee could require any witness to attend and tell truth.
Lam also spoke about dialogue with community leaders and universal suffrage, something that protesters have been demanding and that's referenced in the 1997 deal when the British left Hong Kong. Is it a positive sign that she mentioned those?
The so-called dialogue we have witnessed from previous experience that this government only pick and choose people from their own camp to have a dialogue with. And even if when they pick somebody from the other side, the Democratic side, they will simply just there to listen and without taking any action. And let me remind everybody who is listening or watching this program, 5 years ago, there was an umbrella revolution in Hong Kong. Carrie Lam, who was then the chief secretary, the number 2 person of the government, she had a dialogue with the then student leaders. And guess what? Out of the 5 student leaders, 4 of them got arrested.
We were there back in July, and we saw when protesters ransacked through the Legislative Council. Beijing has called protesters criminals, even terrorists. Are there any criminals inside the protests and that violence? Is that a concern of yours?
My concern, rather, is by withdrawing the bill, is laying foundation for Carrie Lam to put forward something called emergency regulation, which is totally unchecked, which is totally a very powerful piece of legislation that empowers the chief executive, that is Carrie Lam, of course, to make any regulation to restrict basic freedoms, including to ban freedom of assembly. And this is something that really concerns not only Hong Kong people, but also the international community. We fear that over the past few months, we have witnessed, including Hong Kong officials and Beijing officials, they accuse Hong Kong protesters as terrorists or even having a color revolution, which is totally unsound, which is totally groundless and unfair.
You brought up color revolutions, of course, referencing the Eastern European movements that overthrew communist governments. Are you saying that what you are asking for is actually limited and that you're not asking for any kind of independence from mainland China?
We are not asking for independence. We are asking for universal suffrage to freely elect our chief executive and our legislature as promised by Beijing. We are not asking for the moon. We are being very reasonable here.
You started by saying that this was too little, too late. Does that mean the protests will continue?
Hong Kong people cannot take it as a victory. In fact, it's still far, far from victory. When police brutality cannot be dealt with, when Hong Kong people are still demanding for something that we were supposed to be granted years ago, that is universal suffrage to freely elect our leaders, then I'm sure Hong Kong people will not give up.
Alvin Young, thank you very much.
Thank you.